Welcome to part 3 of my 3-part series on how to edit your drone footage, specifically with the Spark. In part 3 we'll be talking about color grading, sharpening, and a couple of extra things that will really make the difference between good footage and great footage. So since my first 2 videos turned out to be about 15 minutes each, and I know the attention span of the average YouTube user is about 1/4 of that, we're going to do this video a little bit differently. We're going to go over the highlights, we're going to pick a couple of specific techniques to go over in depth, and hopefully it will result in a little bit shorter of a video with a lot more material. My goal, as always, is that hopefully you'll pick up 1 or 2 things that you'll be able to use in your videos. Today we'll be going over the specifics of retiming your shots and making sure that there's fluid movement across the whole shot. We'll be going over a little bit of sharpening, and we'll be going over color grading, which is definitely the most personal item that we'll be talking about, and I fully expect that what I do won't fit with what everybody else does. But if you like the way that my shots turn out, hopefully it will be helpful to you. So the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to color grading and editing is the use of compound clips in Final Cut Pro. And I only mention this because it took me so long to figure this out that maybe it's taken other people a while as well. Any clip that you shoot and then cut up and splice back together, or any time you're shooting lots and lots of clips with the same lighting conditions and the same general effect, you can put these clips together and then edit them as one entity rather than editing one clip at a time and trying to make them all look the same later. I'm sure that it took me longer than most, but this has been a very helpful thing for me. Okay, so let's get right into the good stuff on a very easy clip. The first thing that I add is generally the basic sharpening that's built into Final Cut Pro 10. I don't change any of the options or anything like that. I just stick it on pretty much every clip. I like the way it looks. It gives it a kind of GoPro feel to the final product, and although some people think that the footage straight out of the Spark is over sharpened to begin with, I think that this just crisps it up a little bit and makes it look like I want it to. And at the end of the day, it's all personal preference. I prefer a sharp picture. Next, I'll begin to adjust the exposure using the basic color board that's built into Final Cut Pro 10. The first thing I do is adjust the highlights and the lowlights so that they're just short of clipping. Obviously, you want to maintain detail in both the light areas of the frame and the dark areas of the frame, but you want enough contrast that it looks different and that the histogram, even though you can't see it, is evenly distributed across the whole display that your computer, your camera, etc. is capable of doing. For saturation, I like to oversaturate the highlights. I think that it gives an awesome look, especially during the golden hour of sunrise or sunset. It'll really bring up the colors in the bright spots of your picture, and it'll give them that golden look without oversaturating the shadowy parts. And if you have any history with photography or digital imaging, you'll know that noise comes out in the shadows. So I'm always careful about pushing the shadows to be brighter, oversaturating the shadows. It just creates a look that I don't like. Another trick using Final Cut Pro 10 color board is that if you need to adjust the white balance, which there's not any built-in way to do that I've found, what you can do is go to the master color adjustment in the color board, put it at 41, and then adjust the percentage so that it matches the clips around it. 41 seems to be the warmth adjuster of the picture, and as you can see, a small adjustment will actually match it to the clip before or after it. This works pretty well for me. And here we have one of the best tricks that I picked up as far as Final Cut Pro 10 goes, and it is to change the rate conform option to optical flow. What this does is look at the frames around the clip that you've slowed down and blend the frames together together using the data that it's captured in specific frames to fill in the blanks between the frames. So if you're shooting at 48 frames per second and you're slowing it down to 24 frames per second, there is nothing to fill in. It just uses the extra frames that it captured while you were shooting and spreads them out over the timeline of the video that you're producing. However, if you shot at 24 frames per second and you're slowing it down by 50%, then there is a frame missing on every other frame of the video. This is very visible to your viewer, and using this option to fill in the blanks in between the actual video really works surprisingly well for something that's just built into a software piece. There are other frame bending software options out there, but a lot of them cost money, and this one works really, really well. I also want to mention that if you use the speed ramp in Final Cut Pro 10, the rate conform option will not be selectable to you. That is why I don't use that effect anymore. I will create a compound clip and slow the clips down by different amounts manually rather than using the speed ramp. That way I can still use this optical flow option even if I've put a clip together with multiple speeds in it. This is a part of the video that I wanted to make sure that I explained what I did, because it's pretty important if you accidentally leave your drone on automatic picture, because as you can see, this was one continuous clip, but since I left the white balance and the exposure settings on automatic, it changed throughout the shot, and it resulted in different looking sand from the beginning to the end, which I think ruins the continuity of the shot. Even though we're clipping it anyway, it's important that everyone can tell this is the same spot on the beach. It's just different little bits of one shot. So it's important to match the sand so that you can tell the location didn't change, it's just different shots of the same thing. So this is basically accomplished by clicking back and forth between the two shots and adjusting the color board so that it matches as well as possible. The things that need to be adjusted are the exposure as well as the color balance. With a little bit of practice, this is actually a fairly quick process. And since the second two shots actually match, all I do is go back and forth between these two shots and match the settings. Since this is one of my favorite shots of the whole video, I wanted to use it as an opportunity to talk about a couple of different things. One technique that I use is I'll begin to edit the color board of a shot for either the foreground or the background, and then add a shape mask to that edit, which will give us the ability to edit the background with different settings. The shape mask controls are pretty easy. The white dot on the top left adjusts the corners, so you can make it a circle or a square. The white dot in the center moves the shape. The white dot to the right of center adjusts the angle, and the green dots adjust the size in each direction. Now that we have our shape in place, we can edit the sky separately on the outside of the mask. So the inside of the mask controls the colors and exposure of the actual hotel, and the outside of the shape controls the exposure and colors of the sky. This way we can pull the exposure of the sky down quite a lot without having to worry about underexposing the foreground. The space in between the two rectangles is the feather zone, where the two masks inside and outside are blended together. So it's important to keep this in mind while you're pulling those sliders, that you don't want to have a very obvious differentiation between the inside and the outside of your mask. However, you do want to have a nicely exposed sky and foreground. Once we've added a shape mask, since all of our shots move in some way, we'll need to keyframe that mask so that it moves with the shot. This one is a fairly straightforward keyframe since the horizon doesn't move by a large amount. What I do is click at different points in the shot, checking to see if the mask lines up the way that I want it to, and there's not much movement in this shot, so the keyframes are very easy to line up. To set keyframes, you use the diamond icon to the right of whatever item you're editing. You can do this with transforming the whole picture within the frame. You can do this with your shape mask. You can do this with volume. You can do this with any type of aspect of what you're editing by using that little diamond to set keyframes with specific settings for each one, and then Final Cut or whatever editing tool you'll use will take care of the in-between, making it a smooth transition from one to the other. I really wanted to talk about one last thing before we end this, and that is that the motion that Final Cut Pro adds to your keyframe is by default smoothed. And that doesn't seem like a big deal until you start playing your video back and watching it very closely. You can see that the text, which I envisioned following the frame, has this bouncing motion to it, and it's pretty easy to get rid of that, although not very intuitive or obvious. What you do is key through the keyframes that you've added and change each one from smoothed to linear motion. That way the motion in between each keyframe is programmed to be linear rather than speed ramped. I'm not really sure why Apple thought that every motion should be speed ramped by default, since that's just about never what I want, but it's easily fixable. One thing you may need to keep in mind if you're doing this is that you might need to zoom out pretty far to be able to see all the keyframes in question. Another useful tip is to use the right and left arrow that's next to the keyframe icon to move between your keyframes. And lastly, even though you've spent countless hours and much blood, sweat, and tears editing your video, make sure to watch it through in its entirety once, twice, maybe 3 times to try and catch anything that may have slipped through the cracks and make sure that it's perfect and exactly what you want your final product to look like. And there you have it. My total editing time for this whole video was about 2.5 hours, and it resulted in about 5 minutes worth of video. So always keep in mind that the more time you spend shooting, editing, making sure that your shots are perfect and that your perfect shots are included in your final video and nothing else makes the cut will make all the difference in the world. I really had a lot of fun making this little video series, and hopefully you liked it too. Hopefully maybe you picked up 1 or 2 nuggets out of each video. If you did, then I accomplished my goal. Thanks again for tuning in.